the last half of the 20th century, spy planes soared through the stratosphere at 3 times the speed of sound, breaking records that remain to this day. Others lurked quietly at the very rim of hostile nations, listening,
ID8,
photographing, transmitting overheard conversations on secret frequencies halfway around the world. By century's end, they ranged in size from nearly 300,000 pounds to a mere 4 ounces. Covert operatives on the ground were no match for these airborne agents. Unlike satellites that toddled around the globe in predictable orbits, spy planes photographed enemy sites when and where they were needed, usually surprising the enemy. These eyes and ears in the sky came in all shapes and sizes. Some were operational in the Gulf War. Others flew spy missions in Bosnia and Kosovo. Even now, a curious array of spy planes are being developed and tested by a young generation of aeronautical geniuses. Spy planes small enough to take off from the palm of your hand. The story of top-secret reconnaissance aircraft really begins midway in the 20th century, in the darkest days of the Cold War.
The big difference between the superpowers at this time was that the US was more or less an open book and the Soviet Union was a closed book. The Iron Curtain had descended, and in intelligence gathering terms, it was a tough nut to crack.
At the Omaha, Nebraska headquarters of the Strategic Air Command and in Washington, D.C., the belief was that the Soviets had far surpassed the U.S. in bomber production.
duck and cover. Duck.
In fact, this civil defense training film was required viewing for all American school children because of the fear of a Soviet nuclear attack. Many Americans believed that it was only a matter of time before a fleet of Russian Bison bombers would soar across the United States, dropping nuclear bombs on every major American city, every military installation, every armament factory. Then, by 1957, when the Soviets launched the first man-made satellite, Sputnik, these fears reached a fever pitch. Now it was believed the Russians could deliver nuclear warheads from outer space. But in truth, all of these fears were based on very sketchy intelligence. Even 3 years before Sputnik was launched, President Eisenhower knew this challenge had to be met. After a series of secret meetings with his closest advisors, Ike made the difficult decision to build something new. A spy plane based on revolutionary technology. It was codenamed Aquatone, and the CIA was put in charge. Director Allen Dulles chose his assistant, Richard Bissell, to head the project from Washington. Funding for Aquatone would come from one of the CIA's many secret accounts. In fact, the CIA only recently allowed this top-secret footage to be declassified. The work began on December 9th, 1954, in Southern California, in a little-known town called Burbank. The contractor was Lockheed's Advanced Development Company, nicknamed Skunk Works after a wartime comic strip. They were led by an aeronautical engineering genius, Clarence Kelly Johnson. This spy plane eventually would carry the name U-2, short for Utility 2. It was given an elaborate cover story that it was a weather plane designed for scientific experimentation at the highest altitudes. The top-secret onboard camera was designed by Edwin Land, the man famous for creating the Polaroid camera. In late August 1955, just 8 months after work began, the U-2 was ready to fly. It would need to be tested at a secret airfield nearby, but at the time, none existed.
So the US Air Force colonel who had been assigned to liaise between the Pentagon and the CIA chose a site not very far north of the Nevada nuclear test range. He knew that site because he'd flown over it during nuclear weapons tests.
It was a vast, dry lake bed known as Groom Lake, an innocuous piece of property that eventually became the single most secret air base in U.S. history. Today it's known by another name, Area 51. Surprisingly, the entire U-2 project continued to remain a secret, even from Soviet spies. Considering the number of leaks emanating from the Manhattan Project, it seems incredible that the Soviets never infiltrated the black world of the U-2.
That's not hard to understand. The U-2 program was fairly small. It was conducted under conditions of extreme secrecy, and it was developed very quickly.
With test pilot Tony LeVere in the cockpit, the aircraft tested well. By July 4th, 1956, it would attempt its first operational sortie deep into Soviet airspace. At 6 o'clock in the morning, CIA pilot Harvey Stockman took off from Wiesbaden Air Force Base in West Germany. While Americans celebrated their Independence Day, Stockman carefully guided his aircraft over Poland and into Belarusia. As he flew in the direction of Leningrad, Stockman caught sight of MiG fighters attempting an intercept below. In that moment, he chose to trust Kelly Johnson's promise that the U-2, flying at an altitude of 70,000 feet, was too high to be shot down by MiGs or surface-to-air missiles. Stockman held to the course and made it home safely with clear reconnaissance photographs of the forbidden territory of the Soviet Union. But Russian radar had locked on to the U-2 on her maiden spy mission.
Eisenhower understood that the U-2 flights over the Soviet Union would be illegal. They were plainly illegal in international law. He was also worried that if they were detected, the Soviets might misinterpret them as being, for instance, a bomber coming to attack them.
Even so, the president was pleased. Within a year, the U-2's CIA pilots overflying and photographing this immense country proved one thing: that the reports of the Soviets' massive bomber production had been greatly exaggerated. The United States always maintained the U-2's cover story that these flights were strictly scientific, designed to learn more about the weather. To some extent, the U.S. got by with this ruse. That is, until May 1st, 1960. May Day was one of the most important holidays in the Soviet Union. It was also the day that CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot out of the sky in his U-2, his aircraft destroyed. Powers survived the crash, but on the ground, the Soviet military and the KGB awaited him. Years of hard-won secrecy for the U.S. intelligence community were wiped out in a moment, as photographs of Powers' capture eventually were carried by every news organization in the world.
It was not until, literally, the May Day incident that the Americans were aware that it didn't just carry weather sampling equipment, it carried cameras. And its primary mission was not to find out if it's going to be nice and sunny tomorrow, but if it's going to be nice and sunny over ballistic missile sites inside the Soviet Union.
Powers was convicted of espionage and imprisoned. an event that permanently slammed the door shut on U-2 spy missions over the Soviet Union. Then, in late summer 1962, a U-2 captured the first images of the Soviets' military buildup in Cuba. Experts believed the photos revealed the existence of medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles that placed most major U.S. cities within target range of a nuclear attack. Within days of the first U-2 overflight, a second U-2 flew a spy mission over Cuba. It was shot down, and the first American U-2 pilot was killed flying over enemy territory. As Soviet ships headed towards Havana Bay with another shipment of armaments, President John Kennedy called Soviet Premier Khrushchev's bluff.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
He placed a quarantine around the Cuban island. Khrushchev backed down. The ships made a U-turn and headed back to their homeland. Today, Russian experts say that indeed there were atomic weapons in Cuba in 1962, and the Cubans did not have control over them. Had the American president sent in ground troops or attempted to bomb suspected missile sites, the Soviets could have retaliated with nuclear weapons. Photographs from the U-2 flights helped provide the information President Kennedy needed in order to face down the Soviet premier. This resilient spy plane has literally overflown the entire world. In fact, there is no landmass the U-2 has not overflown and photographed. Even so, by the early 60s, a new supersonic spy plane was being tested and refined in the Nevada desert, codenamed Oxcart. Stealthy and sleek, it would become the fastest aircraft on Earth. While the U-2 was still being tested in the Nevada desert in 1955, Richard Bissell of the CIA and Kelly Johnson predicted it would fly undetected for a mere 2 years. They believed that by then the Soviets would have the technology to bring down any U-2 in flight over their borders. But in fact, it took the Soviets 5 years. Even so, it was this concern that prompted President Eisenhower and the CIA to order the engineers at Lockheed's Skunk Works to begin work on the next generation of spy plane. Codenamed Oxcart, the A-12 eventually would be known as the Blackbird.
Even before the U-2 was shot down, President Eisenhower had authorized its replacement with the A-12 and ultimately the Air Force's successor to the A-12, the SR-71. It would fly about 10,000 feet higher than the U-2, but most importantly, it would fly 3 times the speed of sound. And the missile that shot down the U-2 could never catch the SR-71.
In the summer of 1959, President Eisenhower approved initial funding for the top-secret aircraft. The money would come from the CIA, a black budget of $4.5 million. Because the U-2 was so easily visible to Soviet radar, Kelly Johnson designed the A-12 with a reduced radar signature. Its shape and configuration, as well as the materials from which it was created, all served to defeat radar detectability. You could say this aircraft was the first stealth spy plane. It was also the last plane developed with a slide rule instead of a computer. This stealthy aircraft inhabited the black world of the CIA, the Strategic Air Command, and the Air Force for years. The Lockheed Skunk Works engineers who developed and built this unique spy plane never put the Lockheed name on any document, never stamped the drawings with the Skunk Works logo.
There was no cover story. There was no cover story because nobody would believe it would be anything other than what it was. Nobody was going to believe it was a weather plane or anything else.
As with most intelligence collection systems, the SR-71 was born secret and stayed that way for a very long time. Even though thousands of people were working on it, they all had to have special access clearances to learn about the program, and if you did not need to know about it, you didn't know about it.
By 1960, the CIA tasked Lockheed with finding the pilots to fly the A-12. Names of potential candidates were drawn from Air Force files. The CIA was responsible for the intensive security background checks. Like the U-2 pilots before them, the men who finally were chosen were sheep-dipped, meaning they left the Air Force. Their military status was suspended. Then they became civilian employees of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Maintaining secrecy within the government was basically through this compartmented system where anybody who was going to be told about Oxcart had to be approved, had to go through security screening, had to sign a special agreement.
In mid-February 1962, the A-12 was ready to fly. There was one problem. In its time, the A-12 looked like an aircraft straight out of a science fiction film. No one had ever seen anything like it, anywhere. The moment it was airborne, the A-12's secret existence would be revealed to the public. So designer Kelly Johnson and his CIA counterparts decided that the aircraft would have to be disassembled in the Skunk Works plant in Burbank, California, and then hauled to the Nevada desert in a specially built trailer under cover of darkness. And with secrecy assured, on February 26, 1962, the Oxcart convoy arrived at the secret test site at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The CIA worked out a plan with the Federal Aviation Administration. Together, they enlarged the restricted airspace around Groom Lake. A few civilian air traffic controllers received clearance for Oxcart operations. Nearby military facilities were also briefed and ordered not to report radar sightings of any unusual aircraft. The first flight revealed that even in the hands of Lockheed's most experienced test pilot, the A-12 was temperamental and difficult to fly. By the second flight in May, the problems were minimal, and the A-12 went supersonic. The plane was officially announced in the summer of 1964 by President Lyndon Johnson, 7 months after he assumed office.
The system will be used during periods of military hostilities and in other situations in which the United States military forces may be confronting foreign military forces. Further information on this major advanced aircraft system will be released from time to time at the appropriate military secret classification levels.
Some believe his intention was to use the existence of the A-12 to refute charges that he was soft on defense. To this day, there's controversy over how the A-12 was used. According to some experts, in August of 1964, the CIA needed several operational aircraft to overfly Cuba by November 5th. They reportedly had discovered that immediately after the U.S. presidential election, the Soviets planned to use guided missiles to shoot down every U-2 flying over Cuba. Without the U-2's reconnaissance photographs, the U.S. intelligence community would never know if the Soviet Union redeployed their missiles to Cuban soil. They believed that the A-12 was the answer. The problem was that by November 5th, there was no CIA pilot qualified to fly the extremely temperamental A-12. Kelly Johnson volunteered Lockheed test pilots for the highly sensitive flights over Cuba. The CIA record seems to dispute this story. In his book Skunk Works, author Jay Miller revealed that Kelly Johnson kept his own logs which suggest the CIA accepted his offer, and on November 10th, the A-12's first operational sortie over denied airspace was accomplished by a civilian commercial employee. There's no evidence that it was detected by Soviet-made radar in Cuba. Besides, nothing in the Soviet arsenal could have shot it down. In fact, during its operational lifetime, more than 100 missiles were fired at the A-12, by then also known as Blackbird, but none of these aircraft was ever shot down.
One of the most interesting episodes was during the Middle East War in 1973, when the US found it needed more photo intelligence than the satellites could apparently provide. The Blackbird was assigned the job, but European NATO allies refused to grant it basing rights. So long missions were flown out of bases on the US East Coast, and the Blackbird flew across the Atlantic, through the Mediterranean, over Egypt, Israel, Syria and Jordan, and back out the way it came.
For the Blackbird, flying faster than Mach 3, these missions from the east coast of the United States to the Middle East and back were a mere 10 hours long. But the supersonic speed also called for as many as 5 to 6 aerial refuelings. Blackbird flew this difficult mission at least 9 times in just a few months. In fact, during its lifetime, Blackbird was used for aerial spy missions over Vietnam, Central America, Libya, the Middle East, and North Korea. But time, politics, and changing economic priorities began to affect this enigmatic spy plane's operational life. Spy satellites had become more sophisticated, and the CIA was out of the manned aerial reconnaissance business. As a result, the tremendously high cost of maintaining this supersonic aircraft fell largely to the U.S. Air Force, which eventually decided the price tag was just too steep. In November 1989, the fastest aircraft on Earth was retired from operational military service. Today, remnants of this powerful fleet of spy planes are being housed in aircraft museums around the country. No manned jet aircraft ever flew faster than Blackbird, but the changing times demanded more than speed. Quite simply, the Pentagon decision-makers were interested in a spy plane that didn't attract as much attention and had a lower price tag. After the U-2 incident, when Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union, no American president would approve a manned spy flight deep into Soviet airspace. The threat of a nuclear response was too great. And so the American intelligence community found itself between a rock and a very hard place. The U.S. needed to know what the Soviets were up to, what kind of missiles they were testing, what sorts of nuclear warheads they could deliver, and where. The U-2 was out. Soviet SAMs could shoot it down. And the A-12 wasn't operational. Spy satellites did offer clear and detailed photographs. Their presence didn't constitute an act of aggression. but they had their own very serious drawbacks. They were visible and predictable. All an enemy nation needed to do was to camouflage its assets when the satellite passed overhead. As early as 1948, both the British and the American intelligence agencies used retrofitted bomber airframes like the B-29, B-47, and B-50 to scout along the borders of the Soviet Union. But it was difficult for a MiG pilot to tell if the B-47 was a bomber or a reconnaissance airplane, particularly for an inexperienced Soviet pilot. This made spying on the Soviet Union with reconditioned bombers far too provocative. The Air Force needed a nondescript airframe it could fill with a cargo of listening devices, electronic sensors, and analysts. By the early 60s, they found the answer in Boeing's KC-135 jet tanker, a cousin of Boeing's 707 commercial jetliner. It was given the name RC-135. This aircraft could fly at high altitudes. It was large enough to carry all the necessary equipment and operators. And with its onboard sensors, if atmospheric conditions were almost perfect, it could see within a 230-mile radius and hear around the world. Best of all, the RC-135 looked like an airborne tanker or even a commercial jetliner. The Air Force and Boeing could hide their new spy plane where no enemy would think to look, in plain sight.
Since on the exterior of the airplane it looked like a typical C-135, very few people paid attention to it. It was what mattered inside that proved the airplane's capability.
Inside were extremely sensitive, top-secret sensors. So powerful, in fact, they could lock on to an enemy's radar or radio frequencies and literally eavesdrop on enemy conversations taking place on the ground. Originally, this top-secret spy plane was designed to monitor the nuclear capabilities of enemy nations, especially those of the Soviet Union. But in 1961, even before the RC-135 was fully operational, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev announced to the world that Soviet engineers had developed a 100-megaton nuclear bomb.
Boy, this was just a terrifying event, because if the Soviets could produce this, then that meant ultimately that American Minuteman missile silos and other very hardened shelters were quite vulnerable. Moreover, cities like New York could be erased with a single bomb.
The U.S. had to find out if Khrushchev was bluffing. A highly classified program called Speed Light began immediately. The RC-135s flew in very close proximity to what was purported to be a test of this 100-megaton bomb. On board were extremely high-speed cameras, sensors, spectrometers. They photographed and recorded detailed information not only about the blast, but about the after effects.
When I talked to the crew members, they said they looked at the side of the airplane that faced the atomic detonation, and the paint had been burned off. Had the detonation, which was not 100 megatons, had in fact been 100 megatons, the fireball would have been an area the size of Maryland, and the airplane would have been vaporized.
While few declassified details are available, experts do know this, that the crew survived to bring back information on the Soviets' nuclear capability that no other aircraft could have managed. As in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet premier was bluffing. Thanks to the inspiring display of courage on the part of the crew and to the intelligence-gathering abilities of the RC-135, the staff at the Pentagon was aware of the bluff. Sometimes the high demand for secrecy actually inhibits the intelligence gathering process. Whether it's a spy plane, a spy satellite, or an operative on the ground, the information must pass through several hands, from the spy to the analyst and finally to the person who needs it. Some of the RC-135's missions under the operational name Rivet Joint were so highly classified that even on board the aircraft, the flight crew was segregated from the electronics intelligence crew working at the back of the airplane. The flight crew itself did not have the appropriate security clearance.
In one of the airplanes, the Rivet Amber, the latrine was in the back of the airplane, and for a pilot who had to go to the bathroom, literally the crew in the back sort of had to stop what they were doing and put hoods over their equipment or whistle at something like that so that the man with the lower security clearance could go to the latrine.
During the Gulf War in 1991, this kind of secrecy became a severe liability to theater commanders. It frustrated the RC-135 Rivet Joint crews and onboard observers who risked their lives to get this vital intelligence to the men and women on an already chaotic battlefield.
General Schwarzkopf and his battlefield commanders in particular would say, what is the Rivet Joint telling us? What are the satellite photos telling us? What are the U-2 photos telling us? And in a post-Cold War mentality, the people who had those photos in their hands were still locked into this belief that, I'm sorry, you don't have a clearance. You don't have a need to know. And in fact, those were people sitting in their cubicles at Fort Meade, Maryland, or elsewhere, who were thousands of miles distant from the battlefield.
Desert Storm and Desert Shield drew two other Boeing 707 reconnaissance aircraft into battle. The AWACS, an airborne warning and control system developed in the 70s, and the newest spy plane named Joint Stars.
J-STARS was developed in the open. It wasn't a black program like the U-2 or the Blackbird or the stealth fighter or stealth bomber. However, it does have its secrets in the radar processing, and indeed 4 of the radar's 10 modes of operations are still classified.
While Rivet Joint eavesdropped on the enemy's conversations and listened in on their plans, and AWACS watched the airspace, Joint Stars flew above and kept its eye in the sky on enemy troop and weapons movements. Working together, these spy planes dogged the Iraqis from one end of the desert to the other.
One particular J-STARS' success was in providing warning of Saddam Hussein's only real offensive move with his armor at Khafji in the middle of the conflict.
During the battle for the town of Khafji, Joint Stars detected a force of 80 Iraqi vehicles headed directly for the Allies' position. This urgent information was relayed to the Marine Battle Commander. A tactical airstrike was called in on the advancing Iraqis. This early warning prevented a surprise attack and helped to assure a coalition victory. Rivet Joint, AWACS, and Joint Stars provided this same kind of protective intelligence in 1994 in Bosnia and in Kosovo in 1999. Theater commanders continue to thirst for instantaneous battlefield reconnaissance. The American public, the politicians, and the military demand increased safety for soldiers in the field. To satisfy everyone, in the last decade of the 20th century, unmanned, remotely piloted spy planes made their debut in war, in all shapes and sizes. As American military forces deployed to the Middle East for the Gulf War in 1991, another kind of eye in the sky joined the U-2, Rivet Joint, and Joint Stars. It was an unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV, and it gave theater commanders an entirely new ability to see action on the battlefield, almost as it occurred. Quite simply, a UAV is an aircraft that flies without a human pilot on board. The American Army began testing them in the 80s. Most military experts say that UAVs were designed for missions that were either too dangerous, too dull, or too dirty. In this case, too dirty meant politically sensitive. Over 30 years had passed since Francis Gary Powers was shot down in his U-2 spy plane over Soviet airspace. But the fear of another such event still lingered in the corridors of Washington, D.C. During the 90s, this concern and a low price tag pushed UAV development center stage. They are still being tested. In the mid-90s, Lockheed Skunk Works and Boeing created this intriguing UAV called Dark Star.
Dark Star set up 4 dock spot.
It was recently canceled. Sikorsky Aircraft Corporation, a pioneer in the helicopter industry, designed this unique unmanned spy plane called Cypher. And there are many others. But during the Gulf War in 1991, and several years later in Bosnia, a UAV called Pioneer flew successful reconnaissance missions for the American Army, the Navy, and the Marines. The Air Force flew a UAV named Predator.
The political environment of the Bosnia theater did not necessarily allow a armed manned aircraft to overfly parts of the country, whereas an unarmed surveillance type asset such as the Predator were more easily employed.
Predator is actually flown by Air Force rated pilots from a ground station that includes a virtual cockpit. The pilot has a stick, a rudder, and all the aircraft instruments that a normal pilot would use to fly an airplane. Predator carries an airborne video camera whose battlefield imagery is available to ground commanders in almost real time.
Predator was used in the Balkans theater of operations almost continually off and on since late 1995-96 to monitor convoy and troop movements amongst the roads, to search out marshalling areas, to find hidden arsenals such as tanks, anti-aircraft artillery, even airplanes.
In 1999, after the final hostilities had ceased and both the U.S. and NATO forces had moved in to maintain peace between Serbian forces and NATO in Kosovo, the Soviets took over the Pristina airfield. This imagery was provided by Predator. Russian MiGs are seen on the ramp. Trucks are loaded with Russian air crews and maintenance workers. The NATO theater commander tasked with securing this airfield got the information about the Russian presence from Predator quickly at a very politically sensitive time. This imagery was also made available via satellite to NATO headquarters in Belgium and to the Pentagon, thousands of miles away in Washington. The detailed surveillance that Predator provided may have helped to avoid a conflict with the Russians by revealing the true extent of their assets. No reconnaissance pilot's life was ever at risk.
Runway ready. Start well, clear. 3, 2, 1, mark. Power up. Power coming up.
In February 1998, as Predator operated in the Balkans, another UAV was being tested at Edwards Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert. The Global Hawk.
You're talking about a vehicle that can stay aloft over 35 hours and be self-deployable. We could fly from Edwards Air Force Base, where we are right now, and up to the state of Illinois. We could image the whole state of Illinois over 40,000 square nautical miles and then fly back to Edwards all in one mission.
While Predator is flown by a virtual pilot from a ground station, Global Hawk's flight path is pre-programmed by computer and can be mostly autonomous.
aircraft. In the typical scenario, you're going to have 3 Global Hawks that are on station. So 24 hours a day, you're going to have 1 airborne imaging the battlefield.
Wings are level.
Global Hawk has an incredible array of high-resolution sensors on board that can see through clouds and fog, day or night, all from an altitude of up to 65,000 feet.
Clear to command link switch to UH SATCOM and conduct echo test.
Like Predator, it offers almost instantaneous battlefield imagery to theater commanders. Experts believe it will be operational by the year 2003.
Roger, we're good. 100 AGL.
Global Hawk's onboard equipment is commercial off-the-shelf, so it is unclassified. In fact, most UAVs do not live in the world of black budgets and secret airfields, even though their missions may be top secret. Aeronautical engineering firms across the country continue to create, test, and refine even newer unmanned aerial vehicles. Meanwhile, an entirely new class of miniaturized, almost undetectable spy planes are being created to patrol cities and suburbs. With the threat of urban terrorism increasing, tomorrow's battleground may include a city's skyscrapers or its water supply. The enemy's weapons might contain chemical and biological agents that poison the air and water. What kind of spy plane can warn of an enemy's movements in a federal office building, a mall, on a city street, or near a reservoir? And can this same aerial spy technology be used in the more traditional warfighting scenarios? It would seem so, as spy planes with no more than a 6-inch wingspan are being developed and tested. They're called micro-aerial vehicles, MAVs. And they're the brainchild of a little-known arm of the Department of Defense known as DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA has operated at the very edge of public awareness for years. It funded the research and development for some of the most unique and far-sighted defense technologies that in later years were used in the F-117 stealth, the B-2 bomber, and even the Internet.
Micro-air vehicle clearly falls in that category. It's not clear today that the micro-air vehicle is going to find operational utility anytime soon, but it does show lots of promise, and it's worth the small investment that's being made.
DARPA defined a micro-aerial vehicle as an aircraft with dimensions no larger than 6 inches in any direction. And it had to perform a military mission. These restrictions forced the creators to think outside the box in order to invent an entirely new species of aircraft. MAVs are small enough to be carried in a soldier's backpack.
The MAV is potentially an ideal source of information, visual information and maybe even acoustic information, letting the foot soldier know where his opposition is and in what numbers.
During the Vietnam War, both Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army forces camouflaged themselves in the foliage of the surrounding jungle. The only way for the American soldier to detect them was to be close enough to see motion or to hear some small movement. In a jungle setting, armed with an MAV, the foot soldier would have instant reconnaissance. He would know exactly where the opposition was, how many were there, and what sort of weapons they carried.
A micro vehicle is really a revolution in soldier sensing. The idea of being able to have something that you can project in the air, that can fly where you want it, when you want it there, to be able to take pictures and transmit those pictures back to you in real time is a capability that is not in the current military structure, but one that's truly needed.
Combat in desert terrain will prove to be one of the greater challenges for the micro-air vehicle. It relies on its ability to blend against the backdrop of trees or buildings. The flat, endless, monochromatic desert landscape offers no camouflage, no place to hide. But the chance to use these amazing spy planes in this desert environment does exist.
In the Gulf War, it's not out of the question, for example, that we might have taken MAVs, dropped them in numbers from a larger aircraft and allowed them to settle in on areas where we suspected illegal activity.
3, 2, 1, launch.
Experts say the micro-air vehicle will have to earn its way into the soldier's bag of tricks. Once DARPA proves they can fly and carry the necessary payloads, the defense contractors who build MAVs will have to soldier-proof them.
How can I make a shell that is durable enough that I could hand it to a soldier? They can run it through a river as they're doing a river crossing. They can bang it around just like they bang around all of the rest of their things, which is a normal thing to do when you're in the field, and still be able to survive and be able to, when I need it, accomplish the mission that I need it for.
Experts believe it will take another 20 years before MAVs are operational. In the meantime, DARPA has found no need to cloak micro-air vehicles in a veil of secrecy. There are no closed doors hiding this new technology. Yet black programs have always been at the core of spy plane development. As far back as the late 80s, when the SR-71 Blackbird was mothballed, there was speculation about its successor. Today, even trained observers in the US and Europe report seeing lights in the sky, unusual aircraft moving at Mach speeds, then suddenly changing directions. Much of this activity is reported near the legendary secret airfield at Groom Lake, Nevada, known as Area 51.
How much of this is myth, how much of it is reality, is something that we simply don't know. It's entirely possible that one or more unacknowledged aircraft were built, flown, and put into storage in the late 80s and early 1990s.
There's an intriguing story about one so-called mystery spy plane. It is known by the name Aurora. Just as Blackbird was built to succeed the U-2, some experts believe that this was the aircraft created to succeed Blackbird. That Aurora inhabited the secret world of the CIA and Air Force black budgets for years. It was said to fly 8 to 10 times the speed of sound, reportedly soaring at an altitude of well over 100,000 feet.
Aurora was supposed to be able to take off from the United States, fly a reconnaissance mission over the Soviet Union, and return without landing. That's very ambitious. Maybe we're looking at Aurora today when we look at the Lockheed Martin X-33. A lot of people have wondered where some of that advanced technology came from.
Proof that these mystery spycrafts did or did not exist may lie hidden for generations to come.
There's a very large black budget still. There's a very secret test site at Groom Lake still. But on balance, I don't believe that there's anything flying and going operational out there that we don't know about.
All the facts about these spy planes may never be known. But who's to say? 50 years ago, no one believed that a lightweight single-engine glider would become the grandfather of modern aerial espionage. It may be impossible to predict what form spy planes of the future will take. But whatever aircraft this new generation of designers creates, one thing is certain. Soldiers and generals will always rely upon them to patrol the skies of potential adversaries, to photograph, to listen, and to transmit back their vital intelligence.